To me, it's the music. It's my music. It's very different when it's your own compositions. It's your musical vision.
At 66, Frank Gambale has nothing left to prove. A guitar innovator, a fusion pioneer, a legend. But when he finally spoke out, it wasn't about technique or legacy. It was about grudges. For decades, whispers followed him. Rivalries, clashing egos, silent wars fought backstage. Gambale never named names until now. In one stunning reveal, he listed the 6 musicians he hated most. The confession stunned fans, shook peers, and exposed the darker side of a world built on virtuosity. Because behind the flawless solos were fractures few dared to admit. So who made Frank Gambale's list? And why has he carried that anger for so long? The year was 1987, and New York City was alive with its usual chaotic energy: honking cabs, street vendors hawking pretzels and hot dogs, and the hum of conversations spilling out of jazz clubs on nearly every block.
Erst in Concert mit der Wunschformation des in Genf.
For music lovers, it was a golden age, a time when the boundaries between jazz, rock, and fusion blurred nightly in dimly lit rooms where legends and newcomers crossed paths. On this particular night, however, one venue stood out. Its marquee glowed against the damp city streets, announcing a showcase that promised to be nothing short of historic. A celebration of guitar virtuosity, featuring some of the finest players in the world. Inside, the atmosphere was electric. The air carried the smell of stale beer, cigarette smoke, and anticipation. Every seat was filled, and more people lined the back walls. The audience was a mix of sharp-eyed critics, industry executives with notebooks at the ready, fellow musicians eager to study every phrase, and die-hard fans who had followed their heroes from gig to gig. This wasn't just a concert. It was an audition for greatness in front of the people who shaped reputations. Among the evening's performers, one name carried an aura of inevitability: Frank Gambale. By then, Gambale was already making waves across the globe. His mastery of sweep-picking had stunned audiences and terrified other guitarists. Where others fought with the fretboard, Frank danced across it with a grace that seemed almost impossible. His playing wasn't just fast, it was articulate, elegant, and deeply musical. He was no circus act, no shred-for-shred's sake technician. He was, in the eyes of many, the future of the guitar. Backstage, Frank tuned quietly. Focused, but calm. Unlike some of his contemporaries, he didn't boast or strut before a show. He believed the music spoke louder than any posturing ever could. But not everyone backstage shared that philosophy. From the shadows came another guitarist, one of the evening's performers, and a man notorious for his sharp tongue and sharper ego. He was known as much for his confrontations as his talent, and tonight he seemed particularly intent on making his presence felt. "I hope you've practiced, Frank," he said, his voice dripping with mock concern. "Wouldn't want to embarrass yourself out there." The words were meant to sting, to throw Gambale off balance before the first note was played. Frank, unwilling to descend into childish sparring, simply nodded and returned to his tuning. Outwardly, he was composed, but the remark lingered. It wasn't the words themselves, but the intent behind them. A glimpse of malice that suggested the evening would not go as smoothly as planned. The rival struck the first blow strategically. He insisted on performing immediately before Gambale, positioning himself as the act to beat. His set was a spectacle of flash and flare, wild arpeggios, exaggerated grimaces, and dramatic pauses designed to milk the crowd's applause. The audience, half drunk on spectacle, roared their approval. By the time Gambale's name was announced, the room was already buzzing with adrenaline, primed to compare, to judge. Still, Frank strode on stage with quiet dignity. He didn't leap or pose. He simply began to play, fingers gliding effortlessly across the strings. His opening phrases were elegant, precise, a showcase of both speed and musicality. For a moment, the room hushed, drawn in by the sheer command of his instrument. Then, something went terribly wrong. As Frank launched into a soaring solo, his guitar seemed to vanish beneath the mix. Notes that should have cut through like a razor were swallowed by the pounding drums and booming bass. The audience frowned, shifting uncomfortably. Some whispered, a few heckled. Frank adjusted his playing, leaning harder into the phrases. But the problem wasn't his technique, it was the sound. Someone had tampered with the balance. His rival, as it later emerged, had pressured the sound engineer to lower Frank's guitar levels while boosting the rhythm section. It was sabotage, executed with surgical precision. For Frank, the experience was surreal. He could hear himself faintly, could feel the notes under his fingers, but to the audience, the solos sounded weak, almost non-existent. Confusion rippled through the room. Critics scribbled notes. Some fans shook their heads, wondering if Gambale had lost his edge. Still, professionalism kept him anchored. He finished his set with composure, bowed, and walked off stage to a lukewarm round of applause that felt like salt in a wound. Backstage, fury simmered. He confronted the sound engineer, who tried to deflect before finally confessing, yes, he had been pressured into adjusting the levels. Yes, it had been deliberate. And yes, the rival guitarist was behind it. The revelation cut deeply. For Frank, music was sacred. He had dedicated his life to refining a technique that others dismissed as impossible. To be undermined not by failure, but by deceit, was almost unbearable. He didn't name the guitarist publicly. He believed that giving him notoriety would only reward cruelty. But within industry circles, the story spread quickly. Everyone knew who had orchestrated the humiliation. That night, Gambale made a vow. He would never again share a stage with that man. He would not descend into petty rivalries, nor would he give his betrayer the satisfaction of a public feud. But privately, he carried the scar. The night that should have been another triumph instead became a bitter memory. A reminder that in the cutthroat world of music, brilliance wasn't always enough to shield you from sabotage. And so, what could have been a crowning jewel in his career became instead one of its darkest shadows. Los Angeles in the early 1990s had a reputation for glamour and excess, but behind the bright lights and Hollywood parties lay a cutthroat music scene. Studios were temples, sacred spaces where creativity and ambition collided. It was here, in one such high-end recording studio, that Frank Gambale believed he was about to create something extraordinary.
Parts of the world, I love music. I love being a musician. I'm glad I'm a musician. I'm happy to be a musician.
A collaboration that promised to reshape the boundaries of jazz fusion. The partner was a famous keyboardist, a household name in fusion circles. Known for his cerebral compositions, impeccable technique, and sometimes tyrannical studio presence, he had a reputation for both genius and difficulty. Together, Frank and this keyboardist had imagined creating an album that would fuse rock's energy with jazz's complexity and experimental textures. The prospect thrilled Frank. He was eager to challenge himself, to explore new musical landscapes, and to work alongside someone whose ideas could push him further. The first sessions were electric. Gambale laid down intricate guitar tracks, his fingers gliding over the fretboard with a precision that left even veteran engineers in awe. The keyboardist responded with layers of harmonics, rich chords, and experimental textures. For a moment, it felt like magic, a synergy of two virtuosos pushing each other beyond the expected, crafting a sound that was both groundbreaking and thrilling. But soon, tension began to creep in. The keyboardist, whose perfectionism was legendary, started questioning every note Frank played. "Too many notes, Frank," he said one afternoon, his tone sharp, his eyes glinting with impatience. "You're cluttering the space. This isn't a solo showcase. It's about the composition." Frank bristled. In his mind, complexity wasn't clutter. It was the lifeblood of fusion. To remove nuance for the sake of minimalism was to sacrifice the very essence of the music they were creating. Yet he tried to remain diplomatic, hoping the initial tension was just creative friction. As the days wore on, the friction escalated. Arguments became more frequent, each session feeling like a battlefield. Frank's contributions were scrutinized, belittled, and often dismissed outright. He offered melodic runs, harmonic ideas, and rhythmic counterpoints, only to have them rejected without explanation. The sense of collaboration, once so promising, began to feel like control masquerading as direction. The breaking point came in a moment that still haunted him years later. After a long day in the studio, Frank returned the next morning to find several of his meticulously recorded tracks had been erased. Hours of sweat, creativity, and late nights gone. When confronted, the keyboardist shrugged. "Didn't fit my vision," he said, voice devoid of warmth. The act felt less like a professional decision and more like an assault. Frank's work had been invalidated, erased without consent, reduced to nothing more than a footnote in someone else's ego-driven project. He was livid, but he refused to escalate the conflict beyond the walls of the studio. The situation worsened when the keyboardist insisted on being credited as the sole producer, relegating Frank to the status of guest musician, despite the fact that his guitar had shaped the album's signature sound. Industry insiders whispered about the rift, noting how Frank's influence had been excised from the final product. The album, when released, felt incomplete. Critics mentioned its uneven quality, the abrupt transitions, and the absence of the fluid guitar that had been promised. Fans, expecting a collaboration of equals, sensed something was missing. For Gambale, the betrayal cut deep. Music was a communion of ideas, a mutual exchange that elevated everyone involved. To see that bond twisted into unilateral control and erasure left scars. He walked away from the project, refusing to associate further with the keyboardist, who went on to take full credit publicly. Yet even in that bitterness, there was a lesson. Frank learned that talent alone did not guarantee respect, that collaboration required not only musical compatibility, but humility and integrity. He vowed never again to allow his creative contributions to be diminished or erased by someone else's ego. In private conversations with close colleagues, he referred to the incident as one of the lowest points of his career. It wasn't the critics who hurt him, nor the fans who were disappointed. It was the betrayal of someone he trusted to understand, appreciate, and honor his artistry. It was a lesson in the dark side of collaboration, a reminder that even in a world built on sound and expression, ambition and insecurity could corrode the creative spirit. Even years later, when Frank spoke about collaboration, he emphasized respect and shared vision above all else. That studio experience, painful though it was, shaped the way he approached music for the rest of his life. It forged in him a careful balance of openness and guardedness, ensuring that every partnership moving forward was built on trust, not just potential. And though he never publicly named the keyboardist, insiders and colleagues always knew the story. It became a whispered legend, a cautionary tale of how even genius can be overshadowed by ego, and how betrayal, sometimes, is the greatest teacher of all. Not all wounds come from strangers or rivals. Some come from those we once called family. In the mid-1990s, Frank Gambale forged a deep friendship with another guitarist in the jazz fusion scene, a man whose talent was nearly as formidable as Frank's own. They were inseparable on stage, trading solos with the kind of synchronicity that made audiences think they shared one mind instead of two. Their camaraderie was enviable. Outside of performance, they shared long conversations about technique, composition, and philosophy. Fans and colleagues alike saw them as brothers in arms, two virtuosos pushing one another to new creative heights. The bond seemed unshakable. They toured together, co-wrote pieces, and appeared in interviews side by side, radiating mutual respect. Rehearsals were collaborative, filled with laughter, playful competitions, and endless experimentation. In private, they celebrated each other's achievements, constantly challenging one another to reach new levels of excellence. For Frank, this friendship was rare in a field often dominated by ego and rivalry, a sanctuary amid the cutthroat world of music. But success has a way of twisting even the strongest relationships. As Gambale's star rose, so did envy. Subtle tensions emerged at first, missed rehearsal notes, half-hearted compliments, minor critiques that carried hidden barbs. At first, Frank dismissed these as the quirks of a busy musician. But beneath the surface, a sense of rivalry was growing. The man Frank had trusted implicitly was beginning to see himself as overshadowed. The betrayal arrived in its most public and stinging form during an interview. A journalist asked about Frank's revolutionary sweep-picking technique, a method that had already reshaped guitar pedagogy and inspired countless students worldwide. Instead of offering praise, the guitarist, his friend and collaborator, leaned back with a smirk and delivered a calculated blow. "Sweep-picking?" he said. "That's just a gimmick. Anyone can do it if they practice enough. Doesn't make you a real musician." The words landed like a thunderclap. From a stranger, Frank could have shrugged them off, but from a friend, it felt like betrayal incarnate. The statement immediately rippled through the guitar community. Fans debated, forums exploded, and critics began questioning the validity of Gambale's technique. Suddenly, the man whose innovations had inspired a generation was being dismissed by someone who had once stood shoulder to shoulder with him. The aftermath was devastating. Professional relationships were strained, with some colleagues taking sides. What had been a private camaraderie became public fodder. Students and aspiring guitarists who had looked up to both men were left confused, unsure of which voice to trust. The ripple effects extended far beyond the interview itself, challenging the very legitimacy of Gambale's artistry. For Frank, the pain wasn't just professional, it was intensely personal. This was someone he had confided in, shared creative visions with, and considered a brother. To be undermined so publicly by that person cut deeper than any criticism from rivals or the press. The combination of professional slight and personal betrayal left him shaken. From that moment on, the friendship ended. Frank never spoke to him again. The creative synergy they once shared, hours spent co-writing, improvising, and touring, vanished, replaced by silence and regret. In interviews, Gambale remained measured, rarely mentioning the incident, but behind the scenes, the wound festered. He often reflected on how trust could be destroyed in a single sentence, how admiration and loyalty could be twisted into envy and resentment. This episode left Frank with a clear lesson. Not all bonds in music are as they appear. Talent can mask insecurity, and admiration can easily sour into rivalry. Even the closest relationships must be approached with care and respect, Frank realized, was not given. It had to be earned and maintained. Over time, he redirected the energy from this betrayal into his work. Solo projects, teaching, and carefully chosen collaborations became his refuge. He surrounded himself with musicians who respected him, who valued dialogue over ego. And though the memory of that friend's backstabbing remained a source of private pain, it also sharpened Gambale's instincts, teaching him to recognize subtle envy before it could escalate into public harm. By the end, Frank emerged wiser, stronger, and more determined than ever. In the competitive world of jazz fusion, rivals were inevitable. But the betrayal of a trusted friend? That was a wound that left a permanent mark, a reminder that even in the art of music, human frailty could be as damaging as any technical challenge. By the early 2000s, Frank Gambale had transcended the label of guitar virtuoso to become a living legend. His instructional books and videos had reshaped the way aspiring musicians approached the instrument. Students from Tokyo to Toronto studied his every lick, while established players spoke of his technical brilliance with a mixture of admiration and awe. Sweep picking, once a niche technique, had become a core part of modern guitar pedagogy, and Gambale's influence was undeniable. Yet even at the pinnacle of his career, he could not escape the sting of calculated cruelty. This time, it came not from a rival hiding in the shadows of a studio, nor from a collaborator seeking control. It came from a peer intent on humiliation, delivered on a global stage in the presence of cameras, journalists, and fans. The setting was a European jazz festival, one of the continent's most prestigious. Musicians from around the world had gathered, each bringing their unique style to a week-long celebration of improvisation and innovation. Frank was scheduled to perform alongside an all-star lineup of guitarists, bassists, and keyboardists. In addition, The organizers had arranged a panel discussion, an opportunity for featured musicians to share insights about the evolution of jazz fusion, their techniques, and their philosophies. For Frank, it was an ideal platform to speak about his work.
You know, what a crazy song that is, Green Earrings. And I remember hearing that stuff going, now, you know.
Emphasizing that technique was never an end in itself, but a vehicle for expression. The panel commenced smoothly at first. Cameras rolled, journalists scribbled notes, and an eager audience leaned forward, ready to absorb wisdom from their heroes. Then, at a carefully chosen moment, another guitarist on the panel, known for both his wit and sharp tongue, made his move. "You know," he said, turning to Gambale with a smirk, "sweep picking is like using training wheels. It's fine for kids learning to ride, but real musicians eventually outgrow it." The room froze for a split second before laughter erupted. Nervous, awkward laughter from journalists, enthusiastic chuckles from a few fans, and whispers of disbelief from those familiar with Gambale's contributions. Frank, caught off guard, felt the words cut deeper than any criticism he had ever endured. It was not the comparison itself, but the context: public, intentional, and calculated. The cameras captured every second, freezing the moment in digital perpetuity. Frank composed himself quickly. He explained that sweep picking was not a shortcut, but a method to increase efficiency and free the hand for complex harmonic ideas. He emphasized that it required skill, precision, and deep musical understanding. But even as he spoke, he knew the damage had been done. Clips of the insults circulated online within days. Headlines sensationalized the confrontation, and forums exploded with heated debates. Some defended Frank, arguing that the technique had revolutionized guitar playing. Others parroted the insult, dismissing his decades of innovation as trivial. What made the event particularly bitter was the premeditation. This was not a spontaneous comment made in jest. This was cruelty designed for maximum exposure, performed in front of peers, journalists, and fans alike. To Frank, it was not just a matter of pride. It was an attack on his credibility, on the legitimacy of the contributions he had spent decades perfecting. He refused to retaliate publicly. While some suggested a feud or press confrontation, Frank chose silence, believing that responding would only feed the spectacle. Behind closed doors, however, he was furious. Friends and colleagues reported that he replayed the incident in his mind for weeks, analyzing every nuance, every smirk, every calculated pause. It left a permanent scar, a wound that could not be erased by time or professional accolades. Ironically, the insult had an unintended effect. Rather than diminishing his influence, it reinforced his resolve. Frank doubled down on teaching, producing more instructional content, and releasing new material that showcased the sophistication of sweep picking. He proved, repeatedly and publicly, that the technique was not a gimmick, but a language in its own right, a bridge between speed, musicality, and expression. Still, whenever the guitarist who had insulted him appeared in the same circles, Frank avoided direct interaction. Invitations to perform or collaborate with him were politely declined. No explanation given beyond a quiet refusal. For those who asked, Frank simply said that professionalism sometimes meant knowing which battles were worth fighting, and which were best ignored. In the years that followed, the clip resurfaced repeatedly in discussions about sweep picking. Each time, it served as a reminder of the cruelty musicians can inflict, even in public forums. Yet Gambale used it as fuel, continuing to innovate, educate, and perform, proving that lasting respect and credibility were earned through mastery, not applause or approval from peers. The public insult became a defining moment, not in the sense of diminishing his legacy, but in the way it tested it. It reminded Frank that success, visibility, and admiration could make one a target for envy, mockery, or outright attack. And while he forgave in principle, he never forgot, and he never allowed that wound to be trivialized. It remained a quiet, burning reminder that even at the peak of a career, respect had to be defended, not with anger, but with excellence. Touring is often romanticized as a musician's ultimate thrill. The lights, the applause, the rush of performing for eager crowds night after night. For Frank Gambale, however, one tour in the late 1990s turned that dream into a nightmare. A grueling lesson in how unchecked egos and rivalries could threaten even the most promising musical ventures. The tour had begun like a dream. Promoters had assembled a supergroup of elite fusion musicians, players whose technical brilliance was only matched by their reputations for intensity. The lineup promised fireworks, intricate arrangements, virtuosic solos, and the potential for a historic live experience. Cities from London to Tokyo were booked, ticket sales were strong, and the media hailed the tour as a fusion event for the ages. For Frank, it was a chance to bring his artistry to new audiences, to collaborate with peers of equal stature, and to demonstrate the full scope of his musical vision.
The word improvisation means to play.
Yet from the first rehearsal, cracks began to appear. One band member, a bassist renowned for both talent and volatility, seemed determined to undermine Frank at every turn. During rehearsals, the bassist repeatedly criticized his playing. "Too many notes, Frank," he muttered under his breath one afternoon, his tone more sneer than critique. "Tone it down a bit, maybe?" Frank, accustomed to such remarks in moderation, initially tried to ignore it, focusing on the music. But the subtler forms of sabotage soon escalated. On stage, the bassist deliberately extended his solos beyond the allotted time, encroaching on moments Gambale had carefully structured for guitar showcases. Improvised lines began clashing, creating dissonance where harmony should have reigned. Fans noticed the tension in the music, even if they couldn't pinpoint its cause. Off-stage, the conflicts intensified. On the tour bus, arguments over set lists, sound checks, and logistics became daily occurrences. Frank's professionalism collided with the bassist's ego, leading to heated exchanges that sometimes required intervention from crew members. Once, in Madrid, a confrontation nearly became physical, with shoving only avoided thanks to the quick intervention of security personnel. By then, the atmosphere had become toxic. Musicians whispered in hallways, production staff exchanged worried glances, and the mood of the tour teetered on the edge of collapse. Media coverage began to catch wind of the tensions. Rumors circulated about a toxic supergroup plagued by infighting, and fans speculated about secret rivalries. Promoters grew concerned, threatening to cancel shows if hostilities escalated. Frank, trapped between maintaining his artistic integrity and salvaging the tour's public image, felt the pressure mounting. Every performance required not just musical skill, but diplomacy, patience, and careful navigation of fragile egos. Despite the chaos, Frank delivered every show with precision. His solos were masterful, his improvisations fluid and expressive. But the discord behind the scenes bled into the music. Audiences sometimes sensed the friction. Critics noted moments of imbalance, and the synergy promised in press releases rarely materialized on stage. What was meant to be a celebration of musical collaboration instead felt uneven, strained, and, at times, adversarial. The tour concluded, but the impact lingered. Frank left with exhaustion etched into his muscles and a lingering sense of disillusionment. The experience had confirmed a painful truth. Talent alone could not guarantee success. Without respect, humility, and collaborative trust, even the brightest assemblage of virtuosos could falter. In private conversations, Frank described the tour as a masterclass in how ego can destroy music. He spoke of the lessons learned, the importance of vetting collaborators, the necessity of clear communication, and the realization that artistry could be compromised by unchecked personality conflicts. The experience also reshaped his professional priorities. He became more selective about tours, more cautious about partnerships, and increasingly committed to environments where mutual respect underpinned every decision. While the tour could have been a crowning achievement, it became instead a cautionary tale. It highlighted how fragile creative endeavors are when human emotion and ambition collide. For Gambale, it was not merely an episode of frustration. It was a formative trial that shaped the way he approached every project thereafter. Though the memory of the tour remained bitter, Frank converted that pain into resilience. He continued performing, teaching, and recording, more committed than ever to cultivating musical environments that prioritized integrity and collaboration over ego-driven chaos. The scars of that tour were real, but they also served as markers of his endurance, a reminder that brilliance, when tempered with patience and wisdom, could survive even the most corrosive of conflicts. Among all the rivalries, betrayals, and humiliations Frank Gambale endured, there was one that remained singularly defining, not because it was the most dramatic, but because it cut the deepest. This was not a competitor, nor a jealous peer, nor even a former friend. This was someone Frank had once revered, a legendary figure whose very presence had inspired awe in him. The betrayal wasn't just personal. It was a professional judgment from a giant whose approval Frank had long sought. It was the late 1980s when the opportunity arose. Frank had been invited to a recording session with a household name in jazz, an iconic musician whose influence stretched across generations. To share a studio with this figure was, in Gambale's mind, akin to receiving a formal acknowledgement of belonging in the pantheon of jazz greats. He prepared meticulously, rehearsing his pieces, visualizing the session, and picturing himself contributing ideas that would impress a musician whose taste and judgment he deeply respected. The legend arrived, as expected, exuding an aura that commanded attention. Every move was deliberate, every phrase seemed calculated to assert authority. Frank, both nervous and excited, approached the session with humility, but also a fierce determination to prove his worth. He played his first phrases with precision, offering harmonies and runs that demonstrated his technical mastery.
You know, there's things that I play that I fall into, but over the years I'm learning.
For a moment, he believed the session would be a collaboration, a meeting of minds across generations. That belief quickly dissolved. The legendary musician dismissed Frank's contributions almost immediately. "This isn't jazz," he said bluntly, sneering. "This is circus music." The words stung, but Gambale pressed on, hoping to demonstrate the musicality behind his technique. Yet every attempt was met with derision. Solos he had labored over were waved away, ideas for harmonic layering ignored, and suggestions for improvisational passages scoffed at. The rebuke was not constructive. It was a clear statement of exclusion. At one point, after executing a solo with fluidity and power, Frank looked for acknowledgement, only to hear the legend turn to the producer and command, "Get this shredder out of here. He doesn't belong in my band." The words were both shocking and devastating. They were a verdict on his place in the music world, a dismissal not of a single performance, but of his career, his skill, and his identity as a musician. Gambale left the studio that day humiliated, his confidence shaken. For weeks, he replayed the rejection in his mind, questioning his abilities, his choices, and his future. Yet in that darkest moment, something unexpected happened. Rather than succumbing to despair, Frank transformed the humiliation into fuel. He resolved to prove, through his own work, that he did indeed belong, not in someone else's shadow, but on his own terms. In the years that followed, Frank's career flourished. He created music that defied conventional boundaries, blending jazz, rock, and classical influences into a unique and innovative voice. Every album, instructional book, and performance became a testament to his belief in his own vision. The rejection, once a wound, became a motivator, a reminder that external validation was neither necessary nor sufficient for greatness. Although he never publicly named the legend, insiders and colleagues knew the story. It was whispered in studios, discussed in conferences, and occasionally referenced in interviews without direct attribution. The anonymity preserved the dignity of both parties while highlighting the profound impact of the encounter. For Gambale, the lesson was clear. Greatness is not defined by the approval of others, even those we admire most. True artistry requires self-belief, perseverance, and the courage to pursue one's vision, regardless of outside judgment. That final betrayal, so personal, so cutting, became the crucible in which his legacy was forged. Frank often reflected that this encounter shaped the way he approached every collaboration, every stage, and every student he taught. He sought to create environments free of unnecessary judgment, emphasizing respect, encouragement, and growth. And while the memory of that studio session remained a private scar, it also symbolized the fire that drove him, the refusal to be silenced, dismissed, or diminished. In the end, that legendary musician, unknowingly, had given Frank Gambale one of his greatest gifts: the realization that belonging is not granted. It is claimed through mastery, persistence, and an unwavering commitment to one's craft. And through decades of innovation, teaching, and performance, Frank not only claimed it, he redefined it, leaving a legacy that outshone any fleeting judgment or insult. If music is meant to transcend ego, why do the grudges still echo louder than the notes? Frank Gambale's list isn't just about rivalry. It's about the fractures that even brilliance can't disguise. Before time turns confession into curiosity, remember, behind every dazzling performance lies a silence heavy with stories untold. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.